Thank you for joining me, Meg.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And today we will talk about the intersection of AI and quantum technology. You're currently working in a startup as part of the founding team. Could you explain to our audience a bit more about what you're currently doing at your quantum startup, quantum AI startup?
Yeah, absolutely. I will preface this with we're still in stealth mode, so I won't get all too much into it, but kind of from a high level, one of the key things that we're really thinking about here at Cosmic Labs is how do we help make the transition from the software and the hardware that we have today into being able to rely on quantum computing in the ways in which it benefits us. So the thing about quantum today, as many of you may know through seeing the news, is we haven't quite arrived at fault tolerance. And so what that means is we have these special kind of computers. There are a couple of different kinds of them, but none of them have reached the point where there's enough error correction for them to be reliable. So think about it as like if you had a calculator and you would put 3 plus 7 and it might give you a 15 sometimes. You don't exactly want to rely on that all the time. Um, the thing is, though, they're getting better and better. And when they're at this point of fault tolerance, we're going to be able to use them for certain things that they are much better at than contemporary computers or, let's say, GPUs. One example is optimization. So optimization, it's a mathematical algorithm. You can think of it as, say you're trying to get across London. You want to get from point A to point B across the city. There are many different paths to take. If you have a contemporary computer that tries to solve how to get from one place to another, it'll probably take a little while for it to solve that because it has to think through all of the different paths. Quantum computers are particularly good at parallel processing, which just means that it's going to be able to solve the optimal path much faster than a contemporary computer can today. And so that will be really useful in a number of different fields from, finding the best drug to interact with your body to solve a problem, or to finding the best material that is going to be, I don't know, like fire resistant or radiation resistant, to supply chain logistics, which have so many variables that you need to watch out for and counteract. And so I bring all this up because we know that this kind of optimization problem, as one example, is going to be much better on the quantum computer. And we're able to see that now. We just still have to deal with the error part a little bit. And what we're thinking about, I guess, getting back to Cosmic Labs, is that if we wait for fully fault tolerant quantum computers to be ready, that means that we are sitting in the back line using the kind of hardware, the kind of tech that we have today. And then all of a sudden, when we have quantum computers, it's still going to take us a number of years to transition into using them. And that's kind of like, that's really just not the best way to think about things, because that it's many years wasted of really interesting technology. And so what we're doing is we're thinking about, okay, how do we actually apply the benefits of quantum today, counteract the risks, so counteract some of the air issues, and think about using those in modern times. And so our plan is to be integrating the benefits of quantum, specifically for us on the quantum optimization side, to artificial intelligence and to other emerging tech to really amplify what we can do already with AI, what we can do already with GPUs and CPUs. And in the longer term, our plan is to lean more and more on quantum. And so that means, like, rather than, let's say, training models on quantum optimization, we can start to actually be running things on quantum computers. We're not at that point that makes sense right now. It's a little bit too expensive. There's a little bit too much error for it to be realistic. But I think in the next number of years, it will be more so. And so we're seeing ourselves as a bridge to really build out that quantum infrastructure and that ability to take advantage of its benefits.
Fascinating. So should we all be planning for retirement soon? Or what do you think? I know there's a lot of potential in the intersection between AI and quantum technology. At least that's what I'm hearing. I don't fully understand it. It's very few people who can really understand the technological parts of quantum. It's way more complex than even AI. I'm not even sure that, the world-leading experts really understand how quantum works. So it's very mysterious. How long do you think it will take before we can really begin to see the benefits of applying quantum technology in different ways in society?
Yeah. Um, I'll answer that in maybe two pieces, which is in many ways, we've already been benefiting from quantum for a number of years. It's just we are starting to benefit faster and faster. And so I'll say that because maybe to kind of like paint you a picture of quantum science in general. Often when
Hmm?
we think quantum computing, we think of those like, the picture of the quantum computer that like Google or IBM has, which is like this big golden chandelier looking thing. Um, that is a type of quantum computer. There are also other types of quantum computers that aren't giant chandelier looking things. They might be photonic, which means they're using optical lasers really to do the computing, and they don't need to be as big or as cooled necessarily. And then there's also quantum science in general, mechanics. And so when we think about quantum technology, I think the quantum compute part will amplify what we're able to do in other aspects of quantum science. But we're still able to apply different varieties of quantum today. So when I say that, I'll kind of bucket quantum into three different things. One would be quantum compute, so kind of what we talked about in terms of like running optimization algorithms. Another piece would be communication, and this actually means being able to communicate from one node to another, let's say between one satellite and another. If you look into quantum mechanics, it's pretty much a way of entangling two different particles, because when you communicate through lasers, you're really encoding the light waves, the particles within the light waves in order to communicate. And so the nice thing about quantum when it comes to communication is it's a particular way of taking advantage of the way that particles associate with one another to communicate more securely. So this is called like quantum secure communication or quantum communications. And then the last piece is sensing. And so it's really just the ability to sense very small changes within particles at the smallest level. And that one, quantum sensing in general, has been like really, really interesting over the last couple of years. One example, so maybe a very broad one, a MRI is technically a quantum sensor, right? Like you're sensing the magnetic changes that are within somebody's body. Many of us have gotten MRIs today. It's a pretty decent example. They're also much more kind of like cool examples or things that have come out in the last couple of years. Sandbox AQ, it's a quantum science company. They recently completed a fundraise a number of years ago, and they have a product called AQ Nav. And this is a quantum sensor that senses instead of sensing like the magnetic changes in the body, it senses the magnetic field of the Earth, specifically the crustal layer, because it's kind of like a giant magnet, if you will. It emits different magnetic pulses. And so it takes in that information, think of it as like a fingerprint, pairs it with maps that we actually have of this magnetic field and uses that to navigate. And so it's only because of this quantum sensor that we're able to like get this very high fidelity sensing of the magnetic field itself. And it's only through artificial intelligence and machine learning that we're able to say this specifically is the signal that's coming from the magnetic field of the Earth versus all of the other noise out there. Because if you think about if you have like a very sensitive sensor, there are lots of other things it's going to sense. If you're on an airplane, it'll sense the giant metal tube that it's floating through the sky. It might sense the people that are around because we emit magnetic signals. And so you have to have very high fidelity AIML also paired with it in order to figure out what's the signal, what's the noise, and then how do I actually figure out where I am around somewhere in the world based upon what is actually the noise. So super cool example of like we're actually using quantum science today, specifically like quantum sensing is a great example. The last thing that I would maybe include on the quantum computing side is there are a lot of people who are looking at how do we leverage quantum computers today. To answer your question about fault tolerance, though, it's different depending on who you ask, right? I think many experts would have said we won't have like fully ready quantum computers until 20 years from now. Microsoft just last week came out with a new kind of chip that has really shortened those timelines because all of a sudden we're thinking, wow, maybe we have this. It's really like a special kind of material that allows us to do quantum computing with maybe less error. And that shortens the timeline to 5 years, 10 years, depending on who you ask again. And so it'll just be an interesting game of watching to see, do we really have the hardware that is going to enable the kind of quantum computing that we need in order to fully take advantage of it?
5 to 10 years, that's really not a long time, come to think about it. What is your most grand vision for how quantum technology could be used, like say in 10 years, and there's a couple of breakthroughs and everything goes as the optimist wants it to go? How
Yeah.
do you predict or hope it could turn out in the best case
Yeah.
scenario?
It's a great question. I see myself as an optimist. And so if quantum is used for the benefit of the earth and the benefit of well-being, we could use it to solve the hairiest problems that we haven't been solving today. Think like massive issues in climate change and how do we reduce our carbon emissions. Think, like massive issues when it comes to how is it that we're generating probably enough food to feed the world and there are people around the world that are starving? A lot of that has to do with supply chain logistics and timing. And really, those are optimization problems, right? And in theory, if we had a team that's sitting down, probably a very large team, but with these like incredible computational abilities, they might be able to genuinely solve these. Um, and so I think like a future of people who are willing to solve these really hard problems and maybe not necessarily focus just on the short-term business benefit of other
Hmm.
problems would be really incredible. I say that last part because many of us thought that we would be doing the same with artificial intelligence, right? Because we do already have some really, really incredible computational abilities. Granted, I think, solving like world poverty would take a longer time on AI. Who knows if we could do it? Maybe we can, but we're spending a lot more money on other things when it comes to artificial intelligence. And I'm not saying that some of these other projects aren't worthy. I think like there are many, many interesting things that people are working on. I think the bigger problem is like, how do we, and maybe this is more of like a philosophical thing, but how do we kind of incentivize mankind and especially, or humankind, especially the people who have access and the know-how of using these technologies to be using them to solve some of these bigger mass problems, as well as some of the shorter term ones.
100% agree. And AI is developed by primarily the big tech companies. They are at the industry leaders. Whereas, in my understanding, quantum technology is a bit more scientific. There's a lot of quantum technology research been done in research institutions and universities. And of course, it's the same for AI, but the universities in the AI industry don't have a lot of power, in my impression. They're kind of backtracked by the big AI companies. It's I think that it's interesting to think about how this new quantum breakthrough can occur in comparison with AI breakthrough. Let's call ChatGPT and the general purpose AI models we all use today a breakthrough. Let's say a similar breakthrough happens in quantum within the next 5 to 10 years. How is that going to play out? I think it's interesting to reflect about. Do you see a lot of what's the right word? Not synchronization, but let's say similarities between quantum and AI, like the way they impact social media and people. Is they like comparable as technologies, or are they
Interesting.
comparable?
Yeah, I think in many ways, yes, in some ways, no. In terms of the kind of timeline of development and ownership, I'll say, I think may be quite similar. And even with artificial intelligence, so much of it really began with academia, right? And honestly, government as well. If you look back into like World War I and World War II and the development of chips and all of these things that I think AI relies upon, much of those kind of processes or research were spearheaded by government and academia. And I think over time, people realized that there were many market applications to it, and the private sector really started rolling. Um, Quantum, I would say, is probably quite similar. And so right now, it's just in order to, at least if you're building the hardware side of it, the quantum computer side, in order to continue to advance, you need a lot of R&D funding, and you're not necessarily going to profit off of it for a little bit. And so who has that? It's going to be very, very large organizations, Google, IBM, some of these big tech players, and then academia and government as well. And I think you'll definitely see more of the academia style work outside of the United States, especially like I think in Europe and the UK and Australia. There's a lot more academia kind of like partnerships working on building and advancing these technologies. It exists in the US as well, but I think it's stronger in other places. It's kind of an aspect where the states are lacking. Uh, but I do think that that'll shift over time, though. And so what'll happen is we'll start to see more and more of these abilities to bring quantum to market, how to monetize it. We'll start to get really the application layer. Like if you think about AI right now, the thing that everybody is super excited about, the thing that VCs are excited about is the application layer, which is like, how do we actually leverage these foundational models in a way that is curated to particular use cases that an end user can benefit from, monetize, whatever it is. We have very small amount of that with quantum. That's one of the things that like Cosmic Labs is working on, for example, is, or not working on the application layer, but how do we bring quantum into the market? And I think that as people do that, as people think about other layers of the OSI model, including the application layer, uh, the people developing these technologies or leveraging them, it might shift more so to the private sector. To comment on like the kind of like some of the concerns that we have with artificial intelligence, or the association with social media and things. Many of the things that we can do on GPUs today, we probably won't be able to do very well with quantum computers. Like quantum computers are going to be really, really great at certain algorithms, but not others. And so I think the world that I see in the future is not going to be quantum actually replaces GPUs or quantum replaces artificial intelligence, but actually how do they go hand in hand? Like I think yeah, that's really going to be where we are heading, is that AI will continue to advance and it will be supplemented by quantum, and quantum will be supplemented by artificial intelligence. They're really I think maybe the quantum sensing example was a great key of like we were able to do these incredible sensing abilities through quantum science, but we need artificial intelligence to do a lot of the data science aspect to make these models work, right? So often they're kind of a pair.
So let me hear you about a myth that you would often come across on LinkedIn and other social media. Do you think that quantum technology can super boost AI, so we'll have something like super intelligence in a few years?
Ooh,
And why not?
yeah, yeah. I mean, probably would be my intuition. I think that so if we think about some of the limitations of AI today, one of them would be compute, right? There's a lot of energy and a good amount of time that it takes in order to train artificial intelligence models. Theoretically, you could apply quantum optimization to that to make compute happen better, faster, more efficiently, which is, I guess, the same thing as better, but whatever. uh, so in that sense, I think that it could make us much faster with developing artificial intelligence models. I think the same thing, and something that we're working on these days with Cosmic, is thinking about the connectivity piece as well. It's like AI is not only about building the models, but it's also about using the models, the inference piece, whether it's happening at the data center side or on individual nodes if we're doing edge compute. And I think that optimization might very well help make that more efficient too. So I think that it could shorten the timeline when it comes to advancing AI. That being said, in terms of like getting us to AGI, like artificial general intelligence, but my here's my thing about AGI. I think that we'll get there kind of no matter what. Like it's a little bit inevitable, and either quantum's going to help it or it's kind of going to happen on its own. My impression, though, and maybe a little bit of frustration with the way that people talk about like superintelligence or AGI these days, is it's not like one day we're going to wake up and be like, oh, obviously AGI is hit. I mean, the media will say that, but I think the reality is it'll be a little bit of a spectrum. So in many ways, we're already like on that spectrum, we're on that ride. Um, but it's like if you ask a neuroscientist or a psychologist to define consciousness or to define like what is a soul, you're going to get a lot of different definitions. And if you like put two people in front of me and say, like one of them is like a kind of like a walking, reasonably abled person, and another one is in a coma, right? And maybe their brain is in a vegetable state, and you say, like kind of what is the line between is this person real and intelligent or has consciousness? You might get different definitions. Same thing, right? Like it is a spectrum in terms of like like how the brain is operating, all of these other factors. And I bring that up because I think AGI is similar in that people are going to have different impressions of when we have or have not reached AGI. And I think in many ways, because we're having trouble even defining human consciousness today, how are we going to fully decide or agree on when we've reached like a similar version or a general intelligence for artificial beings? I don't think we're going to all align on that. And so it'll be maybe one day most of us will just generally agree that computers have outsmarted us and are kind of running the world and things. But I think there will be a lot of disagreement in the meantime. Quantum will probably play a role in that, but I don't know where exactly it will fall. It kind of just depends on time.
That was a good answer. Difficult question.
Long answer, but
Yeah, but
I
it's
mean, I don't
cool.
know
It's
what
it's
what
kind
are
of,
what are your thoughts on.
it's kind of brain melting to think about, because what's right and what's wrong and what's true and what's not becomes very much more difficult when we're kind of out of the business side of it, when we talk about the philosophical side and the moral side and what kind of impacts new technologies will have in society. It's kind of like a bottomless hole. It's really hard to know what's right and wrong. It's exciting to talk about, but if we look at it more practically, well, besides your own company, Cosmic Labs, what kind of companies are you looking out for in the quantum industry? Which kind of companies do you think do work that is worth keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, absolutely. On the computing side, there are a couple of big players that are always going to be of interest. Google, IBM, Microsoft. Um, D-Wave is a pretty interesting one because they're not doing full-on quantum computing. They're doing what's called quantum annealing, which has specific, maybe more near-term applications, fewer broad applications, but it's been kind of interesting because they might be able to in theory, we might be able to benefit from them a little bit faster. There are a couple of companies that are doing photonic computing, which has been pretty fun to watch, like PsiQuantum. And then there are how do I say it? Maybe like quantum hubs that are developing, and I'll put that in a number of ways. It'll either be like really interesting public, private, academic partnership models that are happening. In the UK, for example, I believe they have 5 different quantum hubs that are like hubs at universities, but a lot of private sector players will also be building out technologies, and they have different focuses within the quantum realm. That's really, really cool to be watching. New York, interestingly, has some great quantum development. And I say interestingly because I think New York is known as like the finance capital, right? But they are literally building like physical communication channels between like New York and Brooklyn and in other spots to enable and do research for quantum communications. And this means that there are a number of partnerships with universities, with private companies that are really looking at how do we think about the future of communications and communications infrastructure, and how do we leverage quantum in order to do that? And it's happening like, within Manhattan, which is pretty wild and exciting to watch.
And you also have a Substack publication called CipherTalk. Is that connected to your quantum research, or how does this differ from your everyday work in quantum?
It's a great question, Tobias. CipherTalk started out 2, 3 years ago now. Time is time is weird. It's fake. And it was really because I think it was around the time that ChatGPT was like absolutely popping off, and I felt like I was reading so much, but getting frustrated with two things. One was that I just kept consuming information and not really doing anything about it. And my brain had just turned into this vacuum of half-baked ideas, which is
Hmm.
not always the best place to be. But also, I think so much of the uh, discourse had a lot of jargon. And this is a problem of technology and of science in general, is I think that we want to be precise about language. We want to talk about these things and not be too general. But I think that means that often we use language that kind of closes the door from other people wanting to learn about it or feeling like they're capable of learning about it. And that's especially dangerous when you talk about emerging technologies that have everyday implications, right? Artificial intelligence is a great example. I mean, even back when I was in high school or early undergrad, technology felt like a thing that maybe wasn't necessarily a big part of my life, right? It was like a tool that I would sometimes use, and that was just kind of it. And I felt like I wasn't really part of that world. And later on, actually through the policy realm and working in government, came to realize how much of an intersection there was between everyday life and technologies, and how it changes how we see the world, what kind of agency that we have, right? Um, and really the goal of the newsletter was to try and break down, just like once a week, a key theme of something that's happening in the world, and why does this matter to us? What does this actually mean in everyday terms, rather than using all of the lingo that everybody else is. So that's how CipherTalk came into being. It actually used to be called Our Digital Disco, which was really fun to say, but it didn't necessarily align with what I was trying to do. And then back in November, I kicked off a podcast, and it's more or less the same thing, but I think I've over time started to double down more on deep tech in particular, which means quantum. It can mean other things as well, but usually within the realm of like quantum or hardware or space tech or artificial intelligence, and really just thinking about what are some of the things that are happening, and what does this mean to us as everyday humans? What does this mean to us as business leaders? If you're an entrepreneur and trying to figure out how do you build something that's going to still exist 5 years, never mind 15 years from now, how do you take advantage of these technologies? All of those are just really important conversations to have.
So, what do you plan to delve into over the next months and perhaps years on your publication? Do you know?
Yeah. I have inklings of what I will be, but I will say that I'm surprised every week sometimes about the things that I write about. Like I didn't realize that my most recent publication was about I guess bringing it back to Microsoft, their new chip, and I didn't know that that was going to be released, and that we would have kind of like new topological materials, which is crazy. So it's really exciting to write about that. So I think part of it is it's very good for me because it forces me to make sure that I'm staying on top of whatever the news is. But in terms of kind of what I predict, it'll continue to be artificial intelligence. I think it will also very much continue down kind of some of the realms that technology is starting to impact in new ways. And I mean that in terms of infrastructure, manufacturing, even defense tech in particular, because I think that so far many of these fields, like manufacturing, for example, has not changed as much as maybe it could. And now people are really starting to think about how do we apply artificial intelligence in order to better expedite manufacturing, whether it's for supply chain logistics, whether it's for robots that are automated and doing things in a much safer way than if humans were. Kind of different fields like that, where we're starting to see more intersection between technology and everyday life.
And which breakthrough did you think was most promising? Google's quantum breakthrough or Microsoft's quantum breakthrough?
Oh, Microsoft's. I
Okay,
mean,
how
I think,
come?
yeah, yeah. Anyway, I say that because Google's is also incredible, and I don't want to say that it's not. I know that a lot of work has been going into that. Um, what I would say is that it was Willow that was announced in December, right? It is another incremental step from the things that they've been announcing in the past. And so, in a sense, it wasn't surprising. Maybe the timing was surprising of like, oh, it's really cool that we've gotten here by December 2024. But it was like it is well known that they are working on something like that. I was less aware of the material science work that Microsoft has been pursuing in order to kind of like uplift quantum technologies in general. So what they announced was really a special kind of chip that is able to do theoretically computations with less error and bring us closer to having that kind of state of fault tolerance sooner. That I maybe me personally, because I was ignorant, I don't know. I just wasn't aware that they were pursuing that. And I think it's really interesting that they weren't just pursuing a computer that is able to have more qubits, which means do more calculations simultaneously without as much error, but thinking about how do we build from the bottom up? How do we build a new kind of hardware that enables I was going to say transactions, so that's totally the wrong word, but the kind of interactions that we want, the quantum state, if you will, in a pretty new way. And so it was more just like surprising to me in terms of a new kind of news or a different approach that I personally wasn't expecting.
And it leads me back to something we talked about earlier. It's so funny that it is Microsoft and Google that makes headlines in quantum. Is that the reality, do you think? Are there other breakthroughs as big as Google's and Microsoft's that we just don't hear about?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, I am sure. Part of it is a matter of like, frankly, patents and IP. And so I know that there are companies that are building things and probably have built things that they don't want to talk about until they feel secure to talk about them because they don't want people stealing that kind of tech. I think that that happens many a times in news. And that's often why when we hear something about the news, it could have been baking for many, many years and they just, haven't felt comfortable announcing it yet, or maybe um, it's not at the state that they want to announce it. Because you want it to be like really big and ready in order to become public about something. So that's one piece. There is also a bit of an interesting geopolitical aspect to it. And so I say that because quantum is another example of an arms race, right? There are kind of many countries competing against each other. I think China versus the West, particularly the United States, is a good example. And at least over the last number of years, there's been a little bit of an interesting kind of tick for tack happening where China might come out and one of the research institutions will say, hey, we just reached this new level of quantum supremacy. It pretty much means a new level of quantum computer being better at something than a contemporary computer or a classical computer. We just reached this new level of quantum supremacy and it can do X, Y, and Z. And then 2 days later, Google or Microsoft or somebody else on kind of the Western representation will say, well, actually, we did X, Y, and Z, and this is why it's better. And so I think sometimes the big players will kind of wait and not announce their technology because they don't necessarily want to show their cards. But if a competitor announces that they've done something, then they're like, oh, well, I need to show that I'm outclassing them, and therefore I'm going to flip over one card to show that I have been working on this. And so I'm positive that there is a lot of development that's under wraps all around the world, and there's just a bit of a hesitancy about being public with it in order to not have people copy it.
Do you think my statement was correct earlier that there's a lot of important quantum research happening in the universities around the world.
Yeah.
Is because my impression is that, of course, there are many universities that are really focusing on AI, and there's a lot of great AI researchers. No doubts about that at universities. On the other hand, all the important research, or obviously all the important applications, comes from the industry and from the major players. So I feel like the scientific community is a bit backtracked in AI development. Is it the same with quantum, or how do you how would you respond to that?
Mm. Um, I wouldn't necessarily say that the scientific community in AI is backtracked. I think it's been a bit of a maybe many people who were in research style roles have moved into the industry, or there has been a bit of a transition. But it's the way that I see it is oftentimes deeper tech or emerging tech might be within academia. And then once there is more of a way to profit off of it, you start seeing startups doing it, you start seeing companies doing it. And then many of those people might transition into those roles, or many students might start studying that so that by the time they graduate or drop out or whatever, they're able to kind of be in the private sector, but still doing some of the same stuff. I think that we I imagine that we are seeing similar things, but on the quantum side, we're just a little bit earlier. And so, because there are fewer market applications of quantum today than there are artificial intelligence, there's a lot more funding at universities and kind of the safety of exploring that in a university. Because if you're a PhD student and you want to study quantum, you can do that for your PhD. But if you start a quantum company, the odds of really finding your market or your business might be lower than if you're doing an AI company, for example. And so I think that there has just been we're just earlier in that transition to like private sector, like smaller company applications. The other thing that I will say is you're absolutely right in terms of universities focusing on this. And if anything, I hope that continues to grow, because we're already facing a bit of a deficit for people who are highly trained in quantum science and quantum computing. And so this means that the companies that are developing it right now are fighting tooth and nail over the people who have a quantum physics PhD or who have experience, coding on quantum circuits, for example, because there's just not a lot of them. And there's not, like, the universities don't necessarily have, like, at least in the States, there are not that many quantum specific programs, especially at the undergraduate level, to train these people, because it's quantum physics has been seen as like this is a very high level, you're going to be in academia all your life kind of thing for so long. Now it's changing. Europe is way more ahead of the States. Canada is way more ahead of the States, a number of other countries, in terms of having like the academia support to help people pursue these paths. It's starting to shift in the US, but I would say it's pretty weak here, and so it's been nice to see that beginning to change. But academia is super super key to really training the people to get the expertise that's needed to continue advancing the field, and also just to get people excited about it. Like we want to have teenagers who are like, yeah, quantum is awesome, and I this is my dream to build, and we see a lot of that with artificial intelligence, and I hope we land there with quantum soon as well.
Do you think quantum needs regulation?
Yes, but in a different way than AI. I think so much of our fears about AI have to do with generative AI being creating and proliferating deepfakes, right? Or like fake news. We're concerned about automation of things and what does this mean when we take humans out of the loop in certain activities. Quantum is like less likely to be that close to the application layer, at least in the near term. And so I think the consequences of quantum will be different. But just because they're different doesn't mean that they're not real. So one example is on the cryptography side. So one of the big concerns that people have about quantum computers is that we've stipulated for many decades now that using a quantum computer, we will be able to solve much of asymmetric encryption, which is a lot of the encryption that protects our WhatsApp messages, right? It's a kind of encryption that protects when you go to the internet and you make a bank transaction. It's pretty much a kind of encryption that locks down whatever information or data you're trying to send into alphabet soup so that somebody looking at it is like, this is alphabet soup. I can't read it or change it. Quantum computers are stipulated to have the ability to be able to solve, it's pretty much a math function that encrypts this information and be able to de-encrypt and hack quite a bit. Anything from, you know, the codes to nuclear weapons to financial transactions. And it's honestly very, very scary and not as discussed as I think it should be. Some people call it Q day. It's like the idea of like the day that we have this quantum computer, it'll break all of this encryption, and whoever has this computer will have the ability to do a lot of scary things if they want to. And so regulation is key for a couple of things. One is more regulation to help enforce new cryptographic standards, to help government organizations and the private sector, especially finance and healthcare, to transition to a new kind of encryption that's protected from the quantum computer, so to speak. And we actually do have new kinds of encryption. NIST, which is this organization that comes out with protocols and standards, came out with these new kind of like new, we call them like post-quantum cryptography or quantum resilient encryption paradigms that you should be using as an organization. If you use this new kind of math problem, so to speak, quantum computer will have a hard time cracking it. Convincing organizations to transition and them actually doing it is very tough. And so we need regulation to protect. That's just like one specific example. Also regulation in terms of how quantum computers should be applied, right? People should hopefully not be using them to try and crack nuclear weapon codes or using them to, you know, break into JP Morgan and be able to access like a ton of financial data. There should be laws around that. We're not quite there, but I do think it's something that people should be thinking about.
In what kind of time horizon? Like 1 year, 10 years, 5 years?
Yeah. I mean, so on the cryptography side, some regulations are already in place, which is really great. A couple of years ago, at least in the States, there were a couple of memos that came out that enforced certain government organizations to report about what kind of cryptography that they're using. There is less of an incentive right now to transition to a new cryptography standard. But that is changing now that we kind of like have the cryptography that we think is safe. There's a little bit of a game there. But there needs to be more regulation, and that transition is not happening globally. Like it's behind in the United States, and I'm sure it's behind in many other regions around the world. And so I think on the regulation piece, it would be helpful to help support those who are making that transition, whether it's through providing funding, through providing like actual support, because diligencing your cryptography and transitioning is not necessarily something that's easy to do at this point in time. So that's one thing to be thinking about. And I think that should be happening now, just because it's not like somebody could just update their cryptographic standards overnight. A lot of companies have not touched their cryptography in many, many years, if not decades. And so transitioning that will take a couple of years. And so it should be started immediately, if not yesterday. I mean, policy in terms of the quantum computer piece, that'll be harder because that'll turn into a bit of a international collaboration function, right? Because in theory, you can weaponize the computer if we're talking about breaking encryption, if we're talking about optimization for things on like the military or defense side of things. And so I think that we'll have to have some kind of hopefully international agreement or cooperation around those things. I think that earlier steps have been taken. For example, countries collaborating on building the technology, these different academic institutions around the world working together, is a key aspect of this, because that means that we have collaboration on the R&D side, and we're more likely to have collaboration hopefully in the policy side as well. But um, I don't know. I guess it would be ideal for us to start these conversations as soon as possible because Lord knows how long it takes for like
Hmm.
actual agreements to be agreed upon and signed, and then the number of people to change their minds and unsign and whatnot. Um, my preference would be as soon as possible. I don't necessarily see that happening for another couple of years, but I guess we'll see. Often it's like countries or government leaders um, until there is a massive incentive to run at something, there's so many other things that they're prioritizing right now that quantum might not necessarily be it. But the moment that the threat landscape becomes very obvious, I think that will change.
Eventually, I can imagine we'll have the same discussions about quantum as we're having about AI regulation right now. So
Yeah.
perhaps the EU will come with a quantum act and the US will be against it and China will adopt their own thing and the whole thing is just starting over. I think the parallels between AI and quantum is very exciting and extremely interesting. And I want to thank you for your insights and for joining me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a great conversation.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'll make sure to link to your Substack so readers can follow you.
I appreciate that. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
You too. Bye bye. Thank you for listening to Futuristic Lawyer Podcast.